The world's largest pork producer closed 3 of its U.S. plants this week. Smithfield Foods first shut down its South Dakota plant. At least 644 confirmed cases of the coronavirus are linked to that facility. That makes it one of the largest single sources of the illness in the entire nation. The company has since also closed its Wisconsin and its Missouri plants. Several other meat producers have also scaled back or shut down production during the pandemic. Tom Maoli joins me now. He's a global supply chain logistics expert, making him the perfect person for us to talk to about the future of produce in the country. And he also happens to be a former member of President Trump's transition team. Tom, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
So some of the nation's largest meat processing plants are now closed. We're all wondering how this might disrupt not just the supply chain, but the entire meat industry.
Well, listen, it's all, our whole economy runs on supply and demand, and demand right now clearly is out the roof. People are buying, stocking up, eating at home, but the restaurant demand is way down. But what you're doing is you're cutting off the supply chain as they close these plants. It's going to get harder and harder. Prices are going to have to go up because it's a supply and demand issue. But the real issue is, are they going to be able to get the stuff to the supermarket shelves so that people can get product to be able to feed their families? That's the real issue. So it's a supply and demand issue. It's not a distribution issue. But as they continue to close these plants, and rightfully so, listen, if there's coronavirus that's rampant throughout these plants, the last thing you can do is take a risk with our food supply. We still have yet to determine how this affects our food supply and if the food supply can be infected by it.
It's a supply and demand issue, and the demand is there certainly on the consumer side in terms of stocking up our own refrigerators and our pantries, but that it's not there on the restaurant side. Does that sort of cancel each other out, or are we not seeing as much demand as we previously had?
No, demand is way down. Demand is up on the home side, but demand is way down on the restaurant side. Most of the distribution is into restaurants, catering halls. That demand is way down, and that clearly affects what they're doing with this livestock. There's a large portion of the livestock, eggs, produce, that had to be destroyed, actually dumped and destroyed because This is like, milk has an expiration date. This stuff has an expiration date. You can't leave it on the shelf for, weeks and weeks and months. It's not canned goods. So as the coronavirus hit and the demand dropped, they started destroying this stuff because you can't leave it on the shelf. But now as you start closing these plants, I think it's going to be devastating to the supply chain of all the supermarkets. And I think the consumer is going to feel it.
And I'm wondering how we all reconcile the idea that farmers are tossing out meat and produce that they have a surplus of at the same time when my local grocery store is limiting how much milk I can buy for my own family. What accounts for that disconnect?
Well, what happens is that the meat at the livestock at these facilities is prepared. And if the demand is not there and they can't get it out to the shelves fast enough, as the demand fell off and as the restaurants closed down and they can't get it out there fast enough, they're going to have to do something with this because, again, it has a shelf life. So the destruction is not as we speak. I think most of the destruction was in the beginning when most of the restaurants and the catering halls and the eateries closed down. I think that's slowing down dramatically. I don't think that's happening as we speak, but as they start closing plants, we're going to have an issue.
So, I guess bear with me just a little bit because I'm trying to understand. We all generally eat the same amount. So if it's that we're preparing the food at home versus we're going out to restaurants to eat it, is it still the same amount of demand for that food, or that there's actually a change in the demand? I understand that there are two different routes that these producers are selling to either restaurants or to grocery stores, but is the actual amount of demand changing?
It absolutely has changed. When you sell to a restaurant, you sell in volume. When you sell to a consumer, they buy a couple days at a time. They stock in their refrigerator. Most people don't have the ability to store up for multiple days or weeks. And again, this stuff has a shelf life. So I understand what you're trying to say is that if people are not going to restaurants, they're eating at home, but they may not be eating meat. There's other options. Meat is a very large a large selection in a restaurant. Most people go out and they get a steak. And restaurants buy steak, they buy meat, they use meat in the things that they prepare. A lot of people don't do that at home. So, there's restaurants are the largest consumer of meat versus, a home. In a home, there's so many opportunities and options that you have, where in a restaurant, yes, those options and opportunities are there, but most of your dishes are, include some kind of meat.
And how is all of this affecting our nation's farmers and livestock producers? I'm wondering, obviously, if it comes from the farms to these suppliers that are processing the meat in this case, and then over to consumers. With many of these plants shutting down, how is that going to affect that supply chain?
It's financially devastating to the farmers. If the farmers that have raised the livestock can't sell it off, then they've lost their business, and it's devastating to them. And yeah, they can keep the livestock alive. That doesn't have a shelf life, but at some point they need to sell it in order to produce more and keep the machine going. And if the machine's not going, it's like any other business. Things start falling apart, and then it becomes a quality issue. And when we have a quality issue, then we're affecting the quality of food that's coming out to the consumer, and that's a problem.
So it sounds like this could potentially be devastating to farmers, to consumers, to our viewers at multiple different levels. How concerned are you that there will be food shortages? And I want to say also, we've heard from the White House guarantees that this won't be an issue. Is that optimistically speaking, or is there really the possibility that these shortages will take place in the future?
I think they're going to take place. I think that it's clearly the White House is very optimistic, and the president's done an amazing job supporting our farmers, bringing our farming industry back, throwing a lot of money at that industry, which they needed. It was a long time coming. Our farmers suffered for years, and they just, it's sad because they just got on their feet and now they're knocked off their feet again. But the real issue is the farmers are out there and they're out there producing. But if you don't have the meat packing plants that can get the meat into consumer-ready packages and on the supermarket shelves, therein lies the problem. So there's a break in the distribution chain, and the break is at the meat packing plants. And as these things close down, and rightfully so, as I said before, the last thing we want to do is find out that coronavirus can infect our food intake, or be affected by our food intake. And we haven't gone that far with this virus to figure that out. Right now, there's humans dying. So, I agree with them shutting down the meatpacking plants as they need to, because clearly you don't want to infect the people. But that's a break in the supply chain. So the farmers can produce all the cattle they want, the chickens they want, the eggs they want. But if there's no way to prepare them and package them and get them onto the shelf for the consumer to buy, then we're going to have a supply problem. We're going to have a big supply problem.
Absolutely.
At the point of sale, which is
right. That's just as if we don't have truckers bringing them to stores, then that will certainly have a problem. So, Tom, you served on President Trump's transition team. When you hear promises coming out of the White House that don't reconcile with what you as an expert know about the supply chain, have you talked to the White House? Have you said, don't make the guarantee that there's not going to be a shortage, or given them any advice?
Listen, the president is a very smart man. He knows what he's doing. He's got great people in his court. He knows how to get the best of the best people to the table, and that's what he's doing. But listen, this is a big problem, and you can only, it's almost like whack-a-mole. You hit this down and that pops up. You hit this down and that pops up, and you can only put out so many fires in a day. And the task force are working around the clock. I think they're doing an amazing job. Clearly, the curve, right? The curve has gone down, and the demand of the hospitals has gone down. So that's a good thing. And I think they're doing a great job. And I think they're doing the right thing. He's trying to keep the American people upbeat and letting them know and believe, which is what is the truth and what they should do believe, is that we're going to come back, and we're going to come back strong. We're resilient. Americans are resilient. We've come back from many other things. We've come back from the Lehman crash. We came back from 9/11, and we'll come back from this.
Well, we are certainly all hoping that we come back soon, healthy and strong. Tom Maoli, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.